Tonight, does anyone have the solution to the strikes paralysing the country? Well, we have just the right panel to give it a go. We are tonight in the medieval city of Winchester in Hampshire. The Prime Minister went to school just down the road from here, and they've had a Conservative MP since 2010. And after the tragic deaths in the Channel this week, we'll be talking about migration. Also, how's Brexit going for our audience? And should we still be working from home? Welcome to Question Time. This evening, Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg. His Westminster adventures began with his North Somerset election 12 years ago. A supporter of Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss, he served in both cabinets, most recently as Business Secretary. He's perhaps best known for his social conservatism and Euroscepticism and was a leading light of the Brexit campaign. Labour's national campaign coordinator is Shabana Mahmood, which means she has to lead the organisation of her party to win, they hope, the next general election. Before being elected to Parliament in 2010, the Birmingham MP was a barrister. Daisy Cooper is the deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats, who've 14 MPs in the Commons. She also doubles up as the party's spokesperson on health matters and has represented St Albans since 2019. It's been a busy time for Pat Cullen. Today, as General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing, she led tens of thousands of nurses on a walkout, its first ever national strike in over a century. And the journalist and author Peter Hitchens has a regular column in the Mail on Sunday and writes and broadcasts for many other outlets. He's written several books, the most recent of which, A Revolution Betrayed, is highly critical of our education system and the political decisions behind it. Good evening, welcome to Question Time, our last before Christmas. Welcome to our panel, to our audience here in Winchester, great to see you. And of course, welcome to you at home. Don't forget, we are on social media. You can contact us, or we can hear what you've got to say at BBC Question Time, join in the debate. And of course, remember, we are live on iPlayer at 8 o'clock if after 10 o'clock news is too late for your bedtime. Right, let's have our first question, which is from Tim Perry.
Does the nurses' strike demonstrate a catastrophic failure of government management, or rather a government battling hard to get the best deal for the taxpayer?
Right. Well, Pat, I'm obviously going to come to you first as the head of the RCN. You were out on the picket lines this morning. You've been all around, or much of the country today. Does it demonstrate a catastrophic failure of government, or a government battling hard to get the best deal?
Well, a very good question. But the first thing I would say is that I think today has been a tragic day for this country and right across the UK. Tragic for nursing. It's tragic for patients, each and every one of you, and it's tragic for the NHS. It should never have got to this, but it has got to this because of this government. We have tried very, very hard to sit down with the government and speak with them, talk to them, and negotiate on behalf of not just the whole 520,000 nurses that we represent in the Royal College of Nursing, but the 320,000 nurses that give me the mandate that we have got for this ballot. I think every single one of those 320,000 nurses deserve better. And it is a well-known fact. I have walked the breadth and depth of this country, speaking to thousands and thousands of nurses before this ballot started. And some of those nurses took me and showed me the food banks that they're using in the evenings. Some of them also took me and said to me privately, when the patients finish their dinners, we take what's left because we can't afford to eat. We have a heavy and over-reliance on international nurses, bringing in nurses from what's known as red list countries, and that's ethically and morally wrong.
And
so
Pat,
the very short answer to that is they have got this totally wrong.
And Pat, what about the nurses that have not gone on strike? So they're not on. So they don't agree with you, I assume. They're not on strike here in Hampshire. It's only a quarter of hospital trusts in England that are going on strike.
Well, only a quarter of the trusts that we have brought out today on strike. That's the first day of the strike. But there's 126 organisations in England who have voted for strike action and have met those thresholds the very, very heavy and testing thresholds that we have to meet, that this government set for our nurses to have to meet. They have to ballot and meet 50%, and then there's other thresholds that we have to meet after that. So we started today with 46 organisations. And why did we do that? We did that because we wanted to make sure that we managed this strike safely and effectively for every patient, the people that I'm speaking with here tonight in this room, and every other patient in England and Wales and Northern Ireland.
Okay, well,
as time moves on, we unfortunately, if this government doesn't speak to us and doesn't get into a room, I'm afraid that this will escalate.
Jacob.
Thank you. Well, I agree with Pat that it's a tragedy that nurses have gone on strike, and particularly after COVID, and the huge esteem in which nurses are held and the sacrifice that they make to look after people. What has the government offered? It's offered a minimum of £1,400 pay increase, as recommended by the Pay Review Board. The average pay for a nurse, and these figures are from the Times, is £27,055 starting salary and £40,588 after 5 years. So that gives you an idea of what nurses are earning currently. So the pay increase is not huge and is below inflation, but it was what was recommended by an independent pay board.
So when you've got the chair of the Health Select Committee saying the independent pay review body should look again, should reconsider it, and you've also got the former Tory chair saying that 90% is too high, which is what you're asking for, Pat, but that the government offer is too low.
Well, the issue there is that pay review boards sit every year, so that in sometimes when inflation is taking off sharply and the board has reported early, you are behind. The following year you will be ahead as inflation is trending down. And this actually is quite important economically, because you don't want pay rises to come through at the peak of an inflation, because they then add to the inflationary pressure. And it is fundamentally important that we deal with the inflationary pressure. Anyone who remembers the 1970s will remember how dangerous it is if inflation gets out of control.
So do you think the chair of the Health Select Committee, who of course is a fellow Conservative, is wrong that the independent pay review body should reconsider?
He's also the local MP for Winchester, where we are today. I think the pay review body will review this anyway, because that's what pay review bodies do. And why were the pay review bodies set up? Well, they were set up because in the 1980s there were a series of disagreements over pay between various parts of the National Health Service and the then government, and it was agreed that it was better to do it independently rather than one side saying we won't pay and the other side saying we will go on strike. That's why independent pay review bodies are such a sensible way of trying to do it in a way that is fair to everybody. And of course, they will follow the financial data year by year.
Yes, the man in the glasses then.
You're talking about the independent pay bodies like they're gospel, but you don't always follow them. And with junior doctors, you haven't followed them the whole time you've been in power. So are they absolute gospel that we have to basically follow as law, or are you picking and choosing when?
No, the pay review bodies are a very important part of the process. And pay review results are usually implemented. They're sometimes not implemented at exactly the time that is suggested, so there's sometimes a timing issue.
All right, I'm going to get around a few hands before I come around to the rest of the panel. Yes, the man there on the end.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I think, you know, over the years we've got used to different parts of business or organisations going on strike. The nurses one has come as a real shock. But how do you resolve this if there's no conversation? You know, the art of negotiation has to be discussion.
OK, Jake, I'll come back to you because I want to get around the rest of the panel as well. Yes, the woman at the back.
You go on about it's just about wages and how much nurses get paid. It's about the lack of staff. I've turned up for shifts and we've had no staff. So I've done bank shifts and we've had no nurses. So can I just check,
you're a nurse, are you?
I'm a healthcare.
Right.
So I work in main theatre, and every now and then I decide to go off and do a bank shift on the wards. And I've turned up for shifts and there's been no nurses to take over from the night staff. We're bringing in a lot of overseas nurses and they do an absolutely fantastic job, but we need to be training our own people.
Okay.
We need to be bringing people in and training our own people, which is something we stopped doing years ago.
Shabana.
Well, to go back to Tim's original question, I think the nurses' strike is not just a failure of government management. I actually think it's a complete abdication of responsibility by this government, because it is incumbent on the government, if the nurses are going to go on a strike, which they have never done before in their history, right? This is a history-making event. It's on the government to do everything possible to stop that from going ahead. And all they had to do to stop today's strike from going ahead, and Pat and her members have been making this very clear throughout the day, is they just had to open the door and talk about pay. They didn't even have to reach a deal on pay to avert the strikes today. They just had to open the door and accept the principle that they were going to have a conversation with the nurses about their pay, and they failed to do that. So these strikes, I'm afraid, are totally on the government, and they are an abdication of the government's responsibility to make sure that we have the safe delivery of public services in our country and make sure that patients are not being let down.
And what about in Wales then, which is obviously a Labour administration? What's going wrong there then? Because health is a devolved matter to Wales. Are they not opening the door? Are they not having negotiations?
Health is a devolved matter, but in the end, it is the UK government that is doing the
because obviously in
deal.
Scotland, the strike has not gone ahead because a different offer has been made.
Absolutely.
Should they be doing that in Wales?
Well, look, I mean, there's got to be negotiations everywhere, but in the end, it comes down to the Health Secretary of the UK government who are making the decisions about funding, which are then sent out to the devolved administrations in Scotland or in Wales. And I'm afraid there's just simply no excuse for Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, or in fact the Prime Minister himself, for not rolling up their sleeves and doing the hard yards of what government actually involves, which is negotiating and getting a deal. And it's not enough for Jacob and other Tories to basically hide behind the independent pay review bodies. I think one of the audience members said this earlier as well. That's just a convenient excuse. You can set aside what the independent pay review bodies have said. If you know there's going to be a strike, and if you know that the NHS, which is already struggling, is going to have more cancelled operations and more patients let down, if you're the government, it's your job to sort that out.
Peter.
Well, I'm very sorry, but I just don't think that nurses should strike. I think that the profession of nursing is so important and is basically involved in showing mercy to other people when they're in desperate need, that it's an occupation where those who go into it should forswear striking, and I just don't think that they should. That doesn't mean that I don't have any sympathy for the case of the nurses, and it also doesn't mean that I think that the government has handled it well. It is extraordinary, the position we're in. Because of the inflation which we now face, the entire country has undergone a compulsory pay cut. And what we now see is people trying to get back some of what they've lost in that compulsory pay cut. And Jacob Rees-Mogg talks about the danger of inflation, but he was part of an entire political consensus which you could not criticize at the time because I tried, which almost completely guaranteed very severe inflation in this country by its huge, violent, and in my view, totally disproportionate overreaction to COVID, for which we continue to pay. And this is the circumstance in which we find ourselves. The government going on about inflation and saying, we want to stop inflation. They should have thought of that when they started the inflation in the first place. You didn't oppose it. There was no senior political figure who opposed this lunacy, and we now live with it. And the catastrophe is very profound. And then the other thing which you have to understand here is that the whole industrial position has changed since the 1970s and 1980s. I was an industrial reporter at that time on national newspapers, and I remember it very well. In fact, the Tory party seems to believe that Margaret Thatcher was tremendously tough and so they should be like her. In fact, the first thing that Margaret Thatcher did when she came into office pretty much was to pay the public sector quite large increases to avoid another winter of discontent. She didn't walk into these problems, and I don't see why they should. Also, it's simply not economically true now that if you grant public sector workers pay increases, that the private sector will pile in. A large part of the private sector simply is no longer unionized in the way that it was back in the 1970s and 1980s, and it won't happen. I don't know why they've walled themselves into this ridiculous position. It's perfectly possible to make intelligent concessions, but in the end, because of the inflation which they've caused through burning down the house to get rid of a wasp's nest, we are all, everybody in this country, going to take a pay cut.
Let's hear from our audience, then I'll come to you, Daisy. Yes, the woman here in the front.
I was just going to say, so I work for a healthcare agency, and I know that the charge rate of what they charge for a healthcare assistant is roughly about £25 an hour, but the healthcare assistant only actually gets paid £11 an hour. So that margin is a huge margin. In a previous job that I've done in recruitment, we would have people sending in temporary workers. We'd have a margin with them, but it would only be about £2. That wasn't in healthcare. I don't know why there is such a big margin in healthcare, and instead of trying to find money to put towards to give the nurses the pay rise, why we can't use that money that I don't really know where it's going to give the people the pay rise that they want.
To give them more money. It's the woman here in the front.
I understand that pay is a big issue, but I think we're also looking at the fact of the conditions, and we brought it up already, that we don't have enough doctors and nurses. Would the government consider all the emergency services can have their education for free, which would encourage more people, as do 22 other countries, Sri Lanka, Germany?
What, you mean they're training for free?
Yeah,
right.
Because they're stuck with a student loan as well.
Okay, and the man behind you had a question, yes.
Yes, I think this question for Labour. You know, this is an opportunity. Why in Wales, which you are a devolved government, in Scotland, you know, they negotiated with the nurses. You could have led by example by actually negotiating and giving nurses what they wanted in Wales. You failed, you know, you're sort of blaming the Conservatives, but I'm afraid in Wales you haven't done what you should have done.
I mean, that is the point I made to you. Do you want a very brief answer?
Well, I mean, look, in the end, it's the UK government that decides what the funding envelopes are for all of the devolved
Scotland has managed to avoid a strike.
Yes, and there
could you not be doing the same in Wales?
There have to be negotiations. I'm not going to second-guess what conversations have been taking place in Wales. What I'm saying is, in order to avert the national strike that we're seeing, it's on the government. The Prime Minister should have rolled his sleeves up and he should have got a deal with the nurses.
Daisy.
Is it a catastrophic failure of government? Yes, it absolutely is. And it's a tragedy for both nurses and patients. But what's more, I think the government's tactics have been incredibly underhand. The government has used really dodgy figures, misleading figures, to claim that it can't give a pay rise to workers.
Like what?
Well, they claimed it was going to cost £28 billion, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies called that a dodgy number, because actually it's more like half of that, right? So they're using overinflated numbers to try and make their point. I think that's a really underhand tactic by the government. The government has also refused to negotiate on pay, which I think is incredibly underhand, and the government continues to argue that it can't interfere in the so-called independent pay review body. Now, aside from the fact that it isn't really independent because it has its hands tied, it's given the envelope by the government, aside from that point, the government simultaneously claims it can't interfere in this so-called independent process, whilst at the same time it did interfere in that process when it came to the train strikes, and the train bosses and the train workers actually agreed a deal that could have seen off the strikes on the trains this Christmas, but the government intervened and blocked that deal. So the underhand tactics from this government, I think, are utterly disgraceful, and it's the public who are going to suffer.
Let me come back to some of the points made in the panel. So, Pat, what's your response to what Peter had to say? The nurses just shouldn't go on strike. You're in the business of saving lives. You need to be there to do it.
Yeah, I thought that was an incredibly interesting comment. And I would ask a couple of things of Peter. Could Peter live in central London on £27,000 and travel to his work every day, costing possibly around £500 a month to get to and from their work? Could Peter live and keep his family in London on £27,000? Could he pay his utility bills, pay his childminding, and make sure that he keeps his head above water and pay his rent? I would suggest he couldn't. So why is it good enough for a 90% female profession? And in fact, Peter, I found that quite a macho response tonight to my profession and quite an insult.
Well, you can do that if you like, but you're making a huge logical jump. You're saying that because I don't think nurses should strike, that I don't think nurses should be well paid, which is not what I've said. In fact, it's nothing to do with what I said. I said they should not strike. I don't think the police should strike either. Because
so should they just put up and keep quiet?
It's my turn. I don't think the police should strike either. I also don't think the fire brigade should strike. There are a number of people who should not strike. That does not mean that we should let them stew in low pay. It means that any government which recognises that groups cannot and should not strike makes sure they're better rewarded without putting them in the position where they should strike. You made a propaganda response to what I'm saying. Your own organisation in 1988, quite rightly, in my view, condemned a nurses' strike by the then National Union of Public Employees. And it was the Royal College of Nursing was in those days very much against striking for nurses. And I have known nurses, I won't go to huge details, I've known nurses who I can't imagine would ever have even considered going on strike. They would have thought it totally improper as part of their lives. And I think quite a few of your own members have been hesitant about taking part in the strike and about voting for it, as you well know, which is why you held your ballot by organisation rather than nationally. I don't think it's unreasonable for people to say, especially since your own organisation used to say it, that nurses shouldn't strike. And it's not the same thing as saying nurses shouldn't be well paid. I'm saying that governments should understand, as they have for many years with the police, that you can't actually expect certain people to be able to strike, therefore they must be better rewarded. That's the sort of settlement that an intelligent government should be making, and also which an intelligent trade union should be seeking.
So, Jacob, obviously, you're not here.
Don't tell me I don't care about how much nurses are paid, or accuse me of being macho. This is a perfectly sensible political and moral point, which you should listen to.
Jacob, you're not here as a member of the government, obviously, but you're a member of the Conservative Party. We've heard 2 points. One, about how the government needs to get in a room and have a conversation, otherwise how can it be resolved? And Peter's suggesting that the government's effectively painted itself into a corner.
Well, the government has to live with the financial reality that there is. I accept Peter's point that some mistakes were made during lockdown that led to inflation. There was a second round of quantitative easing of about £150 billion, which boosted the money supply in 2020, which had a strong effect on inflation, and that is why interest rates are rising. But the government has a responsibility not to make that worse. That the peer review bodies are...
But the government, some might argue the government also has a responsibility to keep the show on the road and stop people going out striking.
Absolutely. But we've had this discussion on employment within the health service. I've got the figures that there are 9,300 more nurses. Now, I think that doesn't tell you that it's all marvellous. It tells you actually that there's much more that needs to be done with reform of the National Health Service. We are constantly giving it more money. There are now 1.2 million full-time equivalent staff working within the National Health Service.
But there are huge vacancies in the NHS, as you know.
I absolutely accept that. So why are the structures working in the way the lady that said there about how so much is going to agencies and not feeding through to the people who are actually working? What are the structural changes that are needed? I was actually very impressed by Wes Streeting, which are not words you might expect me to say.
Well, do tell.
Absolutely. Of a Labour Member of Parliament, senior Labour frontbench figure, saying that there is a problem with 5 million GP appointments being missed a month. And what does he get? He gets attacked by the BMA for running down hard-working GPs. No, he's pointing out that there is a problem. And these need detailed reforms of the NHS that already receives a lot of money, already employs a very large number of people. Just throwing more money at the problem is not going to make it go away.
All right.
What Wes was actually saying was that we should be investing in more doctors and nurses in our National Health Service. We would abolish the non-dom tax status in order to pay for that. But alongside more money, we want better standards for patients, and we want to make sure that people can get the appointments
they need. 3,800 more doctors last year, 9,300 more nurses.
And we have all of these vacancies, Jacob.
But there are tens of thousands of vacancies, Jacob. You know, it's quite a selective use of figures, if you don't mind me saying. Okay, all right. I think we can all agree there's a huge number of vacancies in the NHS.
But there's a huge number of people working there, so we clearly haven't got people in the right posts.
Okay, all right.
We have 50,000 vacant nursing posts in England alone, Jacob. Now, come on. How do you run a service with those vacancies?
Well, we are employing more every year.
All right. Well, they're certainly not. We're not retaining them in the system. That's the problem. And why are we not retaining them? Because we're not paying them a decent wage.
Okay. All right.
This is a net figure, not a gross figure.
All right. I am going to move on. There are a lot of questions that you wanted asked this evening. I'm going to try and get through them. Before I do, I just want to say this is our last programme of the year. We're back on Thursday, January the 12th, and we will be in Birmingham. And the week after that, we are in Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire. So if you head to our website, if we're coming near you, do come and be on the programme. We would love to see you. So that's Birmingham and Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire. Right, let's take our next question now, which is from Eliza Lazinski.
Nearly 45,000 migrants crossing the Channel this year. Should there be a safe and legal route to claim asylum here before you have entered Britain?
So the situation at the moment is that unless you come through a number of resettlement schemes, particular routes, Ukraine, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, for example, there are a number of them, you have to enter illegally and then claim asylum here, which is the point you're making, Eliza. Jacob.
Well, you've just made the point that there are safe routes to come here. So we have said that...
But obviously only from a limited number of countries.
Absolutely, but that's perfectly reasonable because they are countries that are most at risk. So we had a scheme for Syria, we have a scheme for Ukraine, we have a scheme for Afghanistan, and we have a scheme for Hong Kong. The UK cannot take everybody who wants to come here. That is simply not practical. And if you come here illegally, you ought to be sent back, particularly if you've come from a safe place. That the French, the Germans and the Swedish return almost every Albanian without fail to Albania because Albania is a safe place to be. We return about half of them. And this is a terrible mistake because we saw a tragedy in the Channel yesterday. And this is people who illegally traffic people, making vast profits, risking people's lives. We need to have a system that stops that happening, and that should be an utmost priority. There are safe routes. We saw the figures about how many hundreds of thousands of people we had taken into the country in the last year.
If you come from a country, Jacob, that's not on a safe route, I'm just thinking, we saw the demonstrations in Iran recently, and there's been one execution, another one is planned. So say, for example, you are at risk to your life in Iran because you've been part of the demonstrations. How do you get here legally?
Well, we have a system of letting people come in.
But how do you get here legally from Iran, for example?
If they're coming from France, they are already in a safe country. So we are taking people from an already safe country.
And if they want to come from Iran? I'm just picking that as an example.
I think to come here directly from Iran is extremely difficult because the Iranians won't let you leave.
But would we let them in?
If you've got to a safe country, we would let people in who have a genuine fear of persecution, if they can get here. But if they've got to a safe country first, they don't need to come from France to the UK. We may like teasing the French, but France is not a dangerous country.
Okay,
and that seems to me to be a fundamental point. Once they have got to France, they are safe. Equally, if they've come from Albania, they were safe to start with.
Shabana.
Well, I mean, just listening to Jacob, who's talking about the things that we need in the system and the things that have gone wrong in the system, and so many Tories have been talking about how the system is broken. Who on earth do the Tories think have broken this system? They've been in government for 12 years. This is on them. This is their system, and it is shot to pieces because this government, when it comes to dealing with the Channel crossings, they prefer gimmicks, they prefer rhetoric, they prefer government by vibes, rather than doing the long, hard work of actually getting agreements with other countries. Jacob focused
agreements with other countries to do what?
Well,
to return people?
To return. So this is one of the real problems with this government. They've spent no time at all trying to get a successor agreement to what's called the Dublin Agreement. When we were in the European Union, we were part of an agreement whereby we could return people seeking asylum in our country to the first safe country in Europe that they arrived in on their journey. So we could return people.
We didn't do it very much.
Well, but we could have done it more with returning people to France or Germany or wherever else in the European Union they had stopped off when they were making their journey. We have no successor agreement to Dublin, and this government has spent no time at all trying to get another agreement that would replace the Dublin Agreement.
So to be clear, what your main gripe then, from what you're saying, is not that you want more people to be allowed to come here legally, but you want to be able to return more people to the country they came from.
It's part of a package. We've got to have safe and legal routes for people who are genuinely seeking asylum, and we need to work with the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees to work out where the hotspots are, and I think we should be working closely with them to work out how many safe and legal routes we need and how many people we will take. And I think it's right that Britain plays its part alongside other countries in the world offering asylum. But we also also need to be able to return people who do not have a genuine claim or get them to another safe country. And this government has not put in the hard work of working with our international partners to get deals, to get agreements so that they will take some people as well. And Jacob referenced, teasing the French. Well, I'm afraid they don't owe us a living and they don't owe us a favour, and it's not okay to have Twitter beef with the French government and, play our relationships with our key partners for laughs and, for, making your Tory party members happy during the leadership contest. You actually have to take the job really seriously.
Okay.
They need to be persuaded to do a deal with us, not the other way around.
The woman there in the white sweater.
Thank you. It's all very well talking about sending people back once they get here, but we have to stop people crossing the channel. We have to have some system on the other side of the channel to save people crossing and dying. We have to do something on the other side.
So would you like to see them being processed in terms of asylum claims over there, assuming
yes,
the French wanted to do that?
I don't have a problem with people coming if we want them to come, or they can come and they need to come, but we have a problem with people coming across the channel, disappearing or dying.
Okay. The man at the back there with the check scarf. Yes.
Well, I feel, Labour are very quick to criticise the actions of the government. While Mr Rees-Mogg pointed out a very good solution, I think the solution is very simple, and that is you just don't let these people in. You cannot expect to fix all of the problems we have in this country at the moment with the NHS, the train strikers, and everyone else on strike, and invite all of these people in at the same time. I feel we've got to take...
So on no grounds whatsoever let them in?
Well, I think we need to sort ourselves out first, take the log out of our eye before we try and take the twig out of someone else's.
Okay. Man here at the front in the glasses.
To prevent this tragedy, wouldn't it be better to have safe havens locally to those governments where people are running away for their lives?
So to have places they can go nearer the country they're leaving?
Rather than putting their lives at risk.
Peter?
There's been an enormous change because people have stopped being afraid of crossing the channel. And it's completely transformed the situation. The sea, which we all assumed was a barrier across which people couldn't and wouldn't come, has now become basically a highway. And once people arrive here, it seems to me to be fairly obvious that it's going to be very difficult to send most of them back even if they are illegal. People who arrive here tend to stay. So there's only one sensible policy here, and it's been partly pursued by the government, but not full-heartedly. And a lot of people find it objectionable because it's expensive, and it involves taking France very seriously. I do take France very seriously. I think it's often a better governed country than we are and looks after its own interests better. We are going to have to get the French to stop people putting to sea in the channel in the first place. They cannot, obviously, it's impossible with their coastline to stop it entirely. But if we pay them enough to mobilise their often very efficient and powerful state to do it, we can deter the people smugglers to such an extent that I think this traffic will more or less come to an end, and these tragedies, though they won't ever disappear entirely, will be much, much fewer.
I mean, the government has offered tens of millions. You're just saying they're just not offering enough money.
It's a rational policy. The money that we spend on renewing Trident or HS2, all this rubbish that we do, could be far better spent on securing what is now our real border, our real frontier with France is the French coast. And the only people who are going to secure that are the French. And I am amazed that our political class have not taken this more seriously. It is, by the way, hilarious to listen to Labour criticising the Tories about immigration policy. I don't know quite what position they think they're standing on, but one of the major failures of Labour in many, many years of power was to get any kind of control over immigration whatsoever. But this is something which could practically be done. It's within our power, it's affordable, it's civilised, and it's reasonable. And I really don't see why there isn't more concentration on it.
Katie.
We have a very proud history in this country of taking in people who are fleeing war and persecution, and it is a scar on our country, and it is heartbreaking that people are dying in the Channel. It should not be happening, and we need to stop it from happening before more people lose their lives. Now, some suggestions have been made that we should be working more closely with France. The Conservative government have announced 5 deals with France in the last 2 years, and none of them have worked. There is an answer, there is a glaring answer staring this government in the face, and it is to reopen the safe and legal routes that the government has shut down. We have because the government has closed these safe and legal routes down, there are now lots of vulnerable people who are now desperate to get to this country, and they are paying criminal gangs and traffickers. They are fueling the very gangs and traffickers.
So just explain to us how that would work then, Daisy, when you talk about safe and legal routes. What do you mean?
Well, it's happened before. People from wherever they are leaving, they can go to a refugee camp. We work with the UN Refugee Agency, and they support people who might have a legitimate claim to apply to come here. They're then given a humanitarian visa that allows them to get onto a plane, come to this country, and complete their application. At the moment, that is not allowed, and that is why people are desperate. So these vulnerable people who are fleeing war and persecution are then paying these criminal gangs and traffickers, fueling their industry. So the government's own policy means that we are fueling the very gangs that we want to be breaking up. And as a result, at the same time, there is also... Wait a minute. There is a huge... Wait a minute.
These people are in France. What are they fleeing from in France?
Well, there are some people...
Now, what are they fleeing from? I want to know.
I'll tell you, Peter. If I can answer the question, I shall tell you. There are people who have been trafficked. People are being trafficked, and if they are in France, their end destination is often not their own choosing. If you are being kept by a criminal gang, you have no choice about your end destination. And the fact is that the criminal gangs have said to BBC reporters that this British government are lining their pockets because they know that if they can traffic people into this country, they get an easy deal because the government hasn't introduced the employment rights enforcement needed to go after those awful employers who exploit migrants and employ human traffickers. So the government has not dealt with the supply issue, it hasn't dealt with the demand issue, and as a result, the government's own policies are fueling this issue. It is on their hands.
OK. Man there in the dark sweater, yes.
We're talking a lot about the future and what we want to see in the future, which I think is really important, and safe and legal routes are going to be an incredibly important part of that. But I really worry about what's happening right now, and people have died this week, and hundreds and thousands of people have tried to cross the Channel this year alone, and some of the policies that I think have been announced this week around stopping illegal immigrants from opening bank accounts and housing people potentially in disused army barracks going forward. It just doesn't feel like the caring and compassionate response I would want from the country I live in at the moment.
OK. The woman there in the red top, yes.
No one crossing the Channel wants to cross the Channel. They're absolutely terrified, and it's a last resort. So there's no way anyone's doing that through choice. They're doing that because they have to. So why are we, first of all, enabling this, but also why are we not supporting these humanitarian visas? And then once people are coming here, as we said, there's 50,000 vacancies in the NHS. The hospitality sector's crying out for workers. Why are we not enabling people to work when they come and their claims are being processed, but also encouraging people to come to be able to work? We need the people to be here.
OK. The man behind you.
I've spoken to someone who's in the border forces, and he tells me that the prime reason why these people cross the Channel is because they know they're not welcome in France, Germany and other European countries, and they think we're a more compassionate country. And I think that is the prime reason why they are crossing the Channel and continue to do so. And apparently it's costing some £5 million a day to put these people into temporary accommodation. Well, there's £5 million which perhaps could go towards the nurses' pay rise.
OK. Well, listen, Pat, let me remind you the question. Nearly 45,000 migrants crossing the Channel this year. Should there be a safe and legal route to claim asylum here before you enter Britain?
Look, the first thing I would like to say about this is that every time we talk about them and those that are crossing the Channel, they're all a human being. And I would like to see us making sure that we inject as much compassion and human kindness, and I think that's what this country is about, into those conversations. And tonight, the great nurses that I represent are looking after those mothers and babies that have come across in those dinghies that are trying to hold on to their lives in our hospitals. The second thing I would say, and the lady just mentioned it, there are many skills and expertise amongst those people that are coming into our country. And more recently, His Royal Highness the King has met with my Royal College and other Royal Colleges to have that very conversation with us, to say, what can we do when those wonderful people enter into our country, that we can engage with them and utilise their skills and expertise and integrate them into the country and make the best use of it, particularly within our health service, where we have 50,000 vacant nursing posts. And he went out and met with those individuals himself. And amongst them, he talked to doctors, he talked to nurses, he talked to physiotherapists and psychologists and many others. And he was coming to us and saying, let's work and make sure that we can make the best use of their skills and expertise, because this country needs them.
OK, I'm going to take another question. Graham Croft.
When I'm waiting in a 40-minute Spanish passport queue on my holiday, which Brexit benefit should I console myself with to make my queuing worthwhile?
Peter.
Well, I don't know. I took no part in the campaign for the referendum to leave the European Union for a number of reasons. I believed at the time that we should stay in the European single market. I remain baffled that this option wasn't taken and that it's not more discussed. It's interesting to see now that the Labour Party is so scared of the subject that Keir Starmer says he isn't interested in going back to the single market. I'm apparently more left-wing than Keir Starmer, which is an interesting position for me to be in. I am puzzled at the lack of discussion of these matters. The whole thing seems to me to have been from the start a mess of what was, as far as I was concerned, a rather noble campaign to restore this country's independence and particularly to protect vital characteristics of it, such as its very unique and rather good legal system, turned into some kind of weird campaign to turn Britain into Singapore-on-Thames, which isn't, to me, a particularly attractive prospect anyway. And it's rather obviously hasn't happened. So I'm rather the wrong person to ask. I can genuinely say it's not my fault, which I can't often say that, but I can honestly say it really isn't my fault. You need to ask, I think, Jacob.
Well, let's ask Jacob. So you were, was it Minister for Brexit Opportunities?
I was, yes.
I think. Yes. So tell Graham, while he's fuming in his passport queue, what Brexit benefits he should console himself.
Well, I'd tell him to go to holiday in Portugal, because the Portuguese have given us access to their e-gates, because they recognise that having British tourists is a good thing to do. So you should go where you are welcome. And if the Spanish don't want British custom, there is no need to spend your hard-earned money on Spain. But what are the advantages? The basic advantage is democracy. You now decide how you are governed. Your votes cannot be overruled by a cabal in the European Union, and a corrupt cabal in the European Union, who has been reading the stories about the huge amounts of money. Peter's quite an expert on this and reported on it effectively. Huge amounts of money that have been paid out in the European Union in bribes that we reported about today. Is that how we want to be governed? By a corrupt, crooked European Parliament? Or do we want to make our own laws on your votes? That is the fundamental, principled basis. And then what flows from that? Well, there are things that are already passing through Parliament. So we're having a massive reform of financial services regulation to make our system more competitive. We've got the Solvency II coming through that could put £100 billion extra investment into British industry. These are big things that are happening. The retained EU law bill that could get rid of potentially 4,000 bossy interfering European laws that interfere with our lives, that pass through Parliament without so much as a by your leave.
I mean, you know,
this is really fundamental
groups, Jacob,
democracy.
such as the Institute of Directors, who said, hang on, when it comes to a big bonfire of EU regulation, please don't do that, because you could be throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
This is absolutely fascinating. I'll give you an example of the chemical regulation. The chemical industry complained bitterly against the REACH regulations. They said they're terrible, we hate them, they should never come in. As soon as they came in, they said, oh, that's marvellous because it keeps everybody else out. So you often find that businesses get the protection against competitors and suddenly say, let's keep these regulations. Mm-hmm. So what we want is to put the consumer interest first, and that means deregulating.
Well, there's quite a few hands up. Yes, the man there in the grey sweater.
Yes, I've spent the last 30 years as a director in the wine industry, so I experienced firsthand just how terrible things have become post-Brexit. And I find it incredibly disappointing as a lifelong Conservative voter to hear Jacob saying all this stuff.
So how is it difficult for you?
Just from a bureaucracy point of view and the paperwork, I mean, everything that was literally, we imported and exported wines for 30 years for leading wine companies. And we just see delays, we see paperwork problems, everything has become so much more complicated. And the whole point about, this being oven ready, it's about as oven ready as a frozen turkey take out 5 minutes before Christmas Day. It really is a joke. And I think it's time that someone starts being honest. None of the political parties are actually talking about Brexit, and it's one of the most fundamental problems we've got. Going back to the nurses, it was £350 million a week we were going to give to the NHS, according to Boris's bus. Of course, that's forgotten about. No one talks about it anymore because it's a fundamental breakdown in the truth that politicians are dealing with the electorate. It worries me so much. My daughter's here tonight, and I look at the fact that people can tell untruths time and time again, and then they're just forgotten. And Brexit was the beginning of all this, and I think as a society, it's incredibly worrying about where this is going to lead to.
OK, so Jacob, I'm going to bring the rest of you in, obviously. How do you persuade your fellow Conservative there that Brexit is a good thing when he's saying it's hindering his business?
On wine, we have deregulated the import of wine from Australia and New Zealand, so we're making it easier for other countries to export to the UK.
It's completely not true.
This is exactly what we've done. That's part of the free trade agreement.
No.
So is that helping you?
Not at all. And I'm a member of the Wine and Spirit Trade Association who lobby constantly with the government. And at the moment, the alcohol duty situation is terrible. They're talking about, to make one thing at the moment, without going into too much detail, we've got like 2 bans for wine, so basically over 5.5%, under 15.5%. Very simple. What the government are proposing is to have basically 15 bans within that. At every half percentage point you'll pay duty on. That's a great example of not making things simple. It's going to make it 15 times more complicated.
But that's a tax issue. That's something that the Chancellor decided to do. The import of wine from Australia and New Zealand has been made more simple.
And what about other countries that make wine?
The wine coming in... well, we've done the trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. We have the opportunity to do them with other countries.
France, Italy? I mean, I presume that's what you're talking
Argentina,
about.
I mean, literally, the world of wine, we're one of the most important countries from an export point of view, second only to the United States, for wine buyers and producers to bring it into it. And every single one of the people I speak to outside the UK find it incredibly difficult now to ship wine into the UK. We've taken away one of the biggest success stories we've got. And Brexit, if it's all about making it simple...
Well, we have a huge deregulatory opportunity. As I say, we've done it with Australia and New Zealand, and we need to do it with more. I absolutely agree we should make it really easy to import. That is now under our control, whereas it used to be decided by the European Union.
Before, Jacob. You were taking something that was working, and now you're making it not work.
No. What happened before was there was a market across the European Union, but coming in from outside the European Union was subject to high tariffs and much greater regulation. We have the ability to remove that, and we've already started doing it.
Judging from Graham's face, you haven't convinced him, I'm afraid. Daisy.
So there's absolutely no doubt that the Conservatives' Brexit deal has been devastating for our economy. It has absolutely wrapped up small businesses in red tape and reams of paperwork. In my constituency in St Albans, my hospitality businesses, social care sector, NHS, engineering, they all say they can't get the workforce that they need because they can't bring people in. And we saw just a couple of weeks ago that we would have had 4,000 more GPs coming to the country had it not been for Brexit. We know that farmers have lost out, fishermen have lost out. The trade deals that have been done with other countries have made us worse off, and the other countries have done better out of it.
So what would you do, Daisy?
Well, I mean, to finish the point, which is that Jacobs talks about taking back control. I mean, there's no parliamentary scrutiny or approval of any of these trade deals, and that in itself is really appalling. So what would we do? Well, actually, the Liberal Democrats are the only party that have set out a plan as to how we want to rebuild our relationship with the European Union. At one of our recent conferences, we adopted a 4-stage approach to doing that. First of all, we want to fix the existing deal we have with the EU because it isn't working, particularly for small businesses and for many other parts of our economy. Secondly, we want to look at rejoining many of the programmes that the EU has, whether that's education, whether it's science, or whether it's security. There are many different bodies that we could have been a more influential member in when we left the EU, and the government chose not to do that. Then we want to look at improving the trade deals that we have with other countries, and then at the fourth point, at some point in the future, to rejoin the single market, because I think that is really, really important for this country. So we've set out that 4-stage plan. We are open about talking about that, but I think however anybody voted a few years ago, we don't want to reopen those wounds of the past. We have to look to the future, and it's clear that this deal isn't working.
The woman at the back there with a red streak in your hair.
I agree that Brexit is an absolute disaster for this country, and Jacob Rees-Mogg talks about corruption within the EU. I wonder, what about our own British government? Are they not corrupt?
I don't think we've seen €1 million in suitcases in the UK. I think we should be.
You're talking about from the Qatar government in terms of gaining influence with the World Cup, are you?
I think we don't. I think we don't know formally which government it is.
Hang on. If you shout at once, no one can hear you. What are you saying?
I said we've seen absolutely plenty of contracts given out by Tory ministers to their mates during the pandemic.
The contracts are not given by ministers. Contracts are given out independently of ministers, as you perfectly well know.
OK. Woman in the orange sweater there, with the glasses.
Hi, yes, I'd just like to ask, what's wrong with backing British producers? And what's wrong with drinking British wine and eating British food? Isn't that a far better way to go, rather than everybody moaning about Brexit all the time? I drink lots of English sparkling wine now, and it's far better quality.
OK. So sorry, just saying we've got the
French wine, Australian wine, or any other product. And this guy here, the wine importer, he says it perfectly. Jacob answers by saying it's a tax matter. Taxes are driven by the economic circumstances. Clearly, the economic circumstances were such that drove the Chancellor at the time to generate the kind of taxation that makes it prohibitive for him to run his business successfully.
Shabana.
Well, look, there's no doubt Brexit has been an incredibly divisive issue, and it's still incredibly divisive now. Look, we don't think that, we don't want to relitigate the debates of the past. Won't be going back into the single market under a Labour government. There'll be no return to freedom of movement either. But it is still possible to make Brexit work, and that's our challenge to the government. They've got to get a better deal than what we currently have, and I agree with the comments about the so-called oven-ready deal, which, I mean, is like a frozen turkey and it's still thawing out. And that's where the government has really been asleep at the wheel. They could and should have got a stronger deal with our partners in the European Union. It would help if you don't trash your relationships with the people that you want to do a deal with. You know, they don't, as I said earlier as well, when we were talking about small boat crossings, other countries don't owe us a living and they don't owe us favours and they don't have to do deals with us. So we have to have a grown-up approach to our relationships with the people that we want to do deals with. And then we've got to be really clear-eyed about what those deals need to include. So some of the ways that we could improve the current Brexit deal that we've got that would ease the pressures that we're seeing in our ports and that would stop all of the economic impacts that we're seeing as well. We should get a veterinary services agreement with the European Union. That would stop the issues with the Northern Ireland border, and it would stop the issues that we're seeing with food supply. We are a big exporter of our services. We should be pushing for mutual recognition of services and professional qualifications. That would be a way of improving this deal and making sure that it works for the British economy. So there's lots of practical things that the government could be doing today to make Brexit work. And instead what you get actually is rhetoric from Jacob about, you know, all that we've got back is our democracy. Well, I'm afraid, yes, democracy is very important, but under the Tories it doesn't stop you from being let down by your government. So actually the government has to step up to the plate, get a better deal, make Brexit work, and then we'll see some of these pressures ease off.
Pat.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the fortunate people that has got an Irish passport, so I can actually still manage to get through very easily. But when I'm travelling with my colleagues from other UK countries, I have to wait at the other side for an hour for them to get through, and I don't think that's acceptable. Again, the people in Northern Ireland, the majority did not vote for Brexit. But look what's happening now in Northern Ireland with the protocol, and it has actually collapsed the government in Northern Ireland. So bring that back to the health service. This health service has suffered as a consequence of Brexit. We've seen a complete exodus of European nurses. We couldn't afford to lose any of those nurses out of the system, but they did as a consequence of Brexit, and that has led then to a further over-reliance on international nurses and rating red list countries of the very, very few resources that they've got to fill those vacant posts as well.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to squeeze one more question in from Archie Valentine.
Do the proposals for flexible working, which include making it easier to request working from home, risk damaging businesses already struggling with recruitment and high costs?
Shabana, do you support this proposal? So it basically means from day one, you can request, it doesn't mean you definitely get it, you can request the right to work from home, work part-time, job share, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think we've got to have arrangements for employment rights in this country that keep pace with the changing nature of the labour market. So I think the right to request is fine, and it will suit some sectors.
So you support the government proposal?
Well, yes, I mean, we'll look at all of the details, but in principle, is it right that people are able to request flexible working? Working from home, these are incredibly important ways in which we can get, women back into work after they've taken some time off to have children, for example. Flexible arrangements are incredibly important for a whole host of workers across our economy. It will suit some sectors more than others, and not every sector will be able to accommodate the request, but in principle, I think that it's the right thing to do.
Peter?
I think sometimes people should work from home or may need to work from home, but in general it's not good for other people. Anybody who tries to deal with any kind of government agency at the moment or large firm, many of whose staff are still working from home, will know how much worse the service is as a result. And I don't think it should be a normal thing. I think it's one of the many grave pieces of damage done by the COVID panic, and I think it's time we recovered from it. I'm lucky in this myself. I don't much like working from home. I've tried it. I worked from home twice abroad. You're neither at home nor at work, and also you're much too close to the refrigerator. So in general, I'm against it. But I know some people prefer it, but I just think that if you're working in any kind of service to the public, if you're not working from a proper place of employment or a ministry or a passport office or whatever it is, the service will be worse. And I think we all suffer from that.
Well, there's very few nurses can work from home, so...
but I'm just thinking, because you have admin staff,
yes,
I think,
we absolutely do.
In your union.
And if you think back at the very beginning of the pandemic, people were forced to work from home, weren't they? It was just an overnight move. And now we're into the new world of working in a hybrid way. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I'm a great believer in choice and giving people choice. But the other flip side of that, and I'm a mental health nurse, is that we have seen the consequences of people having worked from home and being isolated and on their own for a long period of time, and the impact that that's had on their mental health and well-being. And by the very nature of being humans, we're sociable beings, so there has to be a halfway house, in many words, that we have time at home, but also that we get together and come in and be together at work.
Now, we've only got a couple of minutes. I need to get two more people in the panel. So, Jacob, you famously went round putting notes on people's desks saying, well, not quite saying come in, but saying I'm terribly sorry I've missed you.
That's right. Basically a canvas card, which all of us who are politicians will have dished out many of. I only did 3 of these, but they got rather more reported upon than I'd actually done.
I presume you don't support this government proposal, then?
Oh, no, I think it's an idiotic proposal.
Just to be clear.
Just to be clear. In my very brief stint as business secretary, I was trying to make sure it didn't happen. But I was only there for 7 weeks. Working from home can be fine. As Peter says, there is a place for flexible working. And when the pandemic struck, it was very important that we kept as much going as possible. And I was actually very keen on Parliament carrying on. And to do that, it had to be remote. But I then became very conscious that the MPs carried on not coming in, but our security teams were all there and the cleaners were all there. And so the better paid you were, the less you had to come in. This didn't seem to me to be particularly fair. I don't think it's fair on the young, who were sitting at home in probably quite small accommodation, and not the best working conditions. It was fine if you're like me and you're middle-aged and you've got a house and a garden. It's not so fine if you're at the beginning of your career.
Jake, I'm
You're
sorry
not-
to
Can I
interrupt.
just...
No, because I've got 30 seconds left.
right, okay,
I'm so sorry.
sorry.
It's just, just something we've got to do because we haven't got time.
It's
Daisy.
the role of government to enable businesses and workers. It is not the job of government to tell businesses and workers what to do or to how to do their job. So yes, we should absolutely support the idea of having a right to request flexible working. In fact, government should be giving businesses and workers more opportunities as well to come to the right arrangements for them.
Right. Our 60 minutes are up, Jake. I'm so sorry. We'd like to have heard more of what you had to say. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to the audience for coming here along tonight. Very good to see you. Christmas is coming for us, for all of you. This is our last programme before Christmas. We will be back in the new year. We will see you next in Birmingham from Question Time. Have a great Christmas. Bye-bye.